He said it casually, like misplacing a password. Your security clearance expired. I nodded, packed my notebooks, and left without a scene. By sunrise, military police were scanning badge logs and asking why the only person with active Section 17 authorization had vanished overnight. The office smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, the scent of quiet ambition and poorly hidden panic. Screens flickered with encrypted streams of numbers, green and amber reflections trembling across glass walls like nervous heartbeats. I had worked in that room for 8 years, 8 winters of silent algorithms and classified briefings, 8 summers of watching men with softer resumes climb faster ladders. And that morning, my manager smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just precisely. Your security clearance expired, he said, folding his hands as if he were closing a minor ticket in the system. For a second, the sentence hung in the air like static before a storm. Clearance doesn't simply expire without notice. Not at Section 17. Not when you're the lead cryptographer responsible for live military encryption keys rotating every 4 hours. I didn't argue. That surprised him. Most people would demand proof, make noise, escalate. I simply nodded, as if he'd reminded me of a dentist appointment I had forgotten. I powered down my terminal slowly, too slowly perhaps, and watched the last cipher session close. He avoided my eyes. That was the first crack, because if my clearance had truly expired, my system access would have been cut automatically, instantly. No polite conversation required. Yet the network light was still blinking. I packed my notebooks. Not the classified ones. Those never leave the building. Just the personal margins, filled with fragments of equations and thoughts scribbled between meetings. He watched my hands as though I might slip state secrets into my coat pocket. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Outside, the corridor hummed with low conversation. Someone from compliance glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Word spreads fast in secured buildings, faster than malware in an unsecured network. I caught a whisper behind the glass conference wall. She lost clearance. Lost. As if it were a badge you drop between sofa cushions. In the elevator, the mirror reflected a woman who looked far calmer than she felt. My pulse was steady, but something inside me had shifted. Not anger yet, not humiliation, something colder. A calculation beginning to compile. Clearance renewals at Section 17 require triple confirmation: internal security, federal registry, and live verification with military police database sync every 24 hours. I had personally helped design part of that verification layer. If my clearance were gone, alarms would be ringing in more places than this hallway. Yet the building was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, winter sunlight sliced across the parking lot. Frost glittered on windshields like powdered glass. I paused before unlocking my car and looked back at the mirrored facade. 8 years of encrypted trust and a dismissal delivered like a clerical typo. He hadn't shown documentation. He hadn't shown regret. Only urgency. Why urgency? The answer tried to surface, but I pushed it down. Speculation without data is noise. I drove home instead. By evening, 3 emails from colleagues arrived, carefully worded, cautiously distant. Heard about the clearance issue? Hope it's resolved soon. Let us know if you need references. References. For someone with active Section 17 clearance. I opened the secure federal portal from my private device. Multi-factor authentication, retinal confirmation, biometric key. The interface loaded. Status: active. Authorization level: Section 17. Military cryptographic oversight. Expiration: 14 months remaining. I stared at the screen long enough for my tea to go cold. He hadn't mistaken anything. He had lied. The realization didn't explode. It crystallized, clean and sharp. Which meant one thing: removing me had required deliberate deception. But why remove the only lead cryptographer during a live system transition week? The next morning at 6:12 a.m., my phone vibrated, unknown government number. I let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning," a firm voice said. "This is Military Police Liaison. We're conducting a routine audit. Our records show your security clearance section 17 is active. However, your facility badge was deactivated yesterday at 15:42. Can you confirm your status?" The frost inside me melted into something else. So the network light blinking yesterday wasn't negligence. It was evidence. I stepped onto my balcony. The city was still waking, buses sighing at intersections, bakery steam rising into pale air. The world looked ordinary. It wasn't. "Yes," I replied calmly. "I can confirm my clearance is active." There was a pause on the other end, paper shuffling, quiet voices. "Then," the officer said carefully, "we need to understand why your employer reported it expired." Reported, not assumed, reported. And suddenly the calm facade of that glass building didn't look solid anymore. It looked fragile, like tempered glass under pressure. Because false reporting to military police about Section 17 status isn't a managerial error. It's a federal violation, and somewhere inside that building, someone knew that. I watched the morning sun climb higher and felt the first wave of something warmer than calculation: hope. If they had lied about my clearance, they had created a record. If they had created a record, there was a trail, and trails, unlike rumors, can be followed. I didn't need revenge. I needed documentation. By 7:03 a.m., military police were on site at the building I had left quietly the day before, and the man who smiled so precisely would soon discover something far more dangerous than confrontation: verification. If you think this was the worst moment of my career, you'd be mistaken. By 8:17 a.m., the building's lobby cameras were recording something they hadn't captured in years: uniformed military police standing beneath the company logo, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Not dramatic, not loud, just official. That was always more unsettling. Inside, employees gathered near the coffee station, pretending to scroll through emails while tracking every movement through the glass doors. In secured environments, fear spreads faster than rumors because everyone understands the stakes. Clearance reviews are private, military police visits are not, and today they weren't there for a routine handshake. I wasn't inside the building to see it, but I didn't need to be. My phone vibrated at 8:26 a.m. "Ma'am," the same liaison officer said, voice measured, "can you confirm whether you submitted any request to downgrade or voluntarily suspend your security clearance?" "No," I replied. Silence again. Longer this time. Because voluntary suspension requires biometric authentication. There would be a record if I had done it. There wasn't, which meant someone else had initiated something they legally couldn't complete. Another vibration, this time from an internal colleague. "They're asking for badge access logs," the message read. "And they're in his office. His, no name needed." I pictured my manager's polished desk, the precisely aligned pens, the framed certification behind him, the one he often gestured toward when reminding us of protocol integrity. I wondered if his hands were still steady. Here's what most people don't know about Section 17 authorization. The holder's status is mirrored in a federal registry updated every 24 hours. Any discrepancy triggers a reconciliation request. Reconciliation requests trigger audits, and audits leave fingerprints. Someone had attempted to deactivate my physical badge while my federal clearance remained active. That's not expiration. That's manipulation. At 9:03 a.m., the liaison officer called again. Your employer reported your clearance as expired during a personnel adjustment. Personnel adjustment, such a gentle phrase for forced removal. I see, I said. What I didn't say, false reporting under Section 17 during active encryption cycle transition week risks operational delay penalties, financial ones, severe ones. And here's where the wave shifted, from hope to something sharper. Because this wasn't about me being pushed out, it was about timing. We were in the middle of rotating a legacy encryption framework to a new adaptive key exchange model. I had built the compatibility bridge. Without me, the transition would stall for weeks, unless someone wanted it to stall. At 9:40 a.m., another message arrived. They're requesting email archives, my colleague wrote, specifically yours and his, from the past 60 days. I leaned back in my kitchen chair and finally allowed myself to feel the first spark of anger. Controlled, focused, useful. Because 60 days ago, I had submitted a compliance memo flagging irregular access attempts to a restricted cipher module. The attempts originated from an executive-level override account. His override account. He dismissed it as a false positive. I archived everything, and compliance systems don't forget. The next call came at 10:12 a.m. Ma'am, the liaison officer said, tone now unmistakably formal. Your clearance remains active. We have documented the discrepancy. You are not under investigation. Not under investigation. The words felt like oxygen. However, he continued, we need to ask whether you were aware of any internal disputes concerning the encryption transition. There it was, the real question. I submitted a compliance memo regarding unauthorized override attempts, I answered evenly. Dated 61 days ago. Another silence, then, very quietly. We have that document. Which meant they hadn't expected to find it, which meant someone had hoped it would stay buried. I stood and walked to the window again. The city was fully awake now. Delivery trucks, horns, a plane cutting through pale blue sky. Ordinary. But somewhere behind mirrored glass, tension was building like pressure in a sealed chamber. At 11:05 a.m., a colleague called, voice barely above a whisper. They escorted him out of the conference room. Escorted, not fired, not accused, just escorted. Investigations are quiet before they become loud. My chest tightened, not with triumph, but with something heavier. 8 years of work, 8 years of believing competence was enough. He hadn't underestimated my skills. He had underestimated the system. Security clearance protocols don't bend for convenience. Military police don't enjoy being misled. And federal registries don't erase logs because someone needs a smoother transition. By noon, the company's internal server flagged an administrative review notice. Staff were instructed not to discuss ongoing matters externally. That alone confirmed it. If my clearance had truly expired, there would be no review, only replacement. At 12:47 p.m., the liaison officer called once more. Your employer has requested temporary consultation pending resolution. You are not obligated to accept. Temporary consultation. A polite attempt to reverse a reckless move. I let the question hang between us. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring windows, bright enough to force my eyes closed for a moment. I remembered the elevator mirror from yesterday, the calm face, the quiet exit. They thought I had walked away powerless. Instead, I had walked into documentation. And documentation doesn't shout, it endures. I will respond formally in writing, I said. Professional, measured, untouchable. Because this was never about revenge, it was about record. If they had simply told the truth, I would have negotiated. If they had raised concerns openly, I would have addressed them. They chose deception. Now the trail existed. And trails, once illuminated, rarely lead where the initiator intended. If you think the audit was the peak of this story, you haven't seen what happens when compliance departments begin comparing timestamps. If you've ever been told something wasn't yours anymore, only to discover it was taken, not lost, tell me in the comments. Would you have walked out quietly or confronted it on the spot? By the third day, silence inside the company had become structured. Not calm, structured. When organizations panic, they generate documents, memos, notices, internal reminders about communication discipline. It's a reflex, like the body producing adrenaline before it understands the wound. At 7:30 a.m., I received the formal request. Temporary technical consultation, encryption transition support. The wording was careful, so was the attached clause offering independent contractor status pending internal review. Pending internal review. The same company that had declared my security clearance expired was now asking me to assist under federal visibility. That detail mattered. Because once military police initiated reconciliation, any subsequent contractual action involving a Section 17 cryptographer required notification. They weren't just inviting me back, they were inviting scrutiny. I printed the document and placed it on my dining table. The paper looked ordinary. The situation wasn't. The ink reflected winter light like something brittle. The wave shifted again, tension tightening at the edges. At 9:12 a.m., an email arrived from compliance. Not from him, from someone above him. We are conducting a procedural review regarding recent clearance reporting discrepancies. Your prior memo has been logged as relevant documentation. Relevant documentation, not dismissed, logged. 61 days ago, I had sat in a conference room explaining why executive override attempts on a restricted cipher module required secondary authorization. He had smiled, just like during the dismissal, and suggested my concerns were overly cautious. Overly cautious is what you call a fire alarm before smoke appears. Now there was smoke. I opened my encrypted archive and reread my original memo. Timestamps, access logs, escalation path recommendations, everything clinically precise. No accusations, just data. The power of calm documentation is that it doesn't age badly. Around noon, my former colleague Lena called. Her voice trembled, not dramatically, just slightly off rhythm. "They're pulling server mirror backups," she whispered. "Full extraction, not just audit sampling. Full extraction." That meant they weren't looking for a minor administrative error. They were reconstructing a timeline. I closed my eyes for a second and let the weight of it settle. This wasn't about a single false report anymore. It was about whether override access had been used improperly during an encryption transition that affected military channels. And suddenly, the narrative inside the building was no longer expired clearance. It was, why attempt to remove the lead cryptographer during a sensitive upgrade window? That question doesn't fade, it multiplies. By 2:04 p.m., I received a call from the same liaison officer. "Ma'am, we will require your availability for clarification regarding system architecture during the review." His tone carried something new, respect edged with urgency. "Of course," I replied. Then he added almost carefully, "You are not under suspicion." Again, which meant someone else might be. The afternoon sky darkened early, clouds gathering like slow-moving witnesses. I stood by the window and thought about how fragile professional reputation truly is. One sentence, "Your clearance expired," had attempted to redraw 8 years of contribution. But systems, remember, Logs remember, and federal registries remember most of all. At 4:18 p.m., an internal announcement was forwarded to me. Effective immediately, Senior Operations Manager will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. No name in the forwarded version, but Lena didn't need to specify. Administrative leave sounds gentle. It isn't. It freezes authority. It locks credentials. It isolates. The same isolation he had attempted to impose on me. The irony wasn't satisfying, it was sobering, because removal through deception leaves traces far louder than removal through honesty. Had he negotiated, reassigned, even confronted me directly, none of this would have escalated to military-police reconciliation. He underestimated protocol, and protocol doesn't respond emotionally. It responds structurally. That evening, the consultation contract remained unsigned on my table. I wasn't avoiding it, I was thinking. Returning as an independent consultant would place me inside the building under entirely different authority lines. I wouldn't report to him. I wouldn't depend on his evaluation. I would operate under review. That changes power dynamics quietly, but permanently. At 7:03 p.m., my secure inbox chimed once more. Reconciliation Phase 2 initiated. All clearance reporting logs preserved. Preserved, there it was. No quiet corrections, no convenient deletions. The trail was now protected. I sat down slowly. 8 years of work had nearly been reduced to a lie delivered in a glass office. Instead, that lie had triggered a process bigger than either of us. And here's the part no one inside that building had calculated. Once military police enter a clearance discrepancy involving Section 17, the matter becomes federal record. Federal records do not disappear with internal negotiations. They remain? Tomorrow, I would decide whether to step back inside those mirrored walls. But if I did, it would not be quietly. It would be documented. The morning I returned, the building looked exactly the same. That was almost offensive. Glass reflecting winter sun. Security gates humming with the same neutral indifference. The faint scent of burnt coffee drifting from the lobby kiosk. Nothing about the exterior suggested that inside, access logs were being examined like forensic evidence. I didn't use my old badge. They had issued a temporary federal access credential, gray, not blue. Contractor designation. Oversight flagged. The guard at the desk straightened when he saw it, scanning twice before nodding. Respect feels different when it's procedural. The elevator ride to the 6th floor felt shorter than usual. Maybe because I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't returning to defend myself. I was returning to clarify architecture. There's power in that distinction. The doors opened, conversations thinned. Not dramatically, just enough to register awareness. People who had avoided eye contact days ago now offered tight, careful smiles. No one mentioned expired clearance. That phrase had vanished from circulation. Instead, the new language was audit, review, process alignment. Corporate vocabulary adapts quickly when the stakes change. Lena met me near the server room, eyes wide with relief and exhaustion. They've reconstructed 48 days of override activity, she murmured, and they're correlating it with encryption migration benchmarks. 48 days. That number mattered, because 48 days ago was when the first irregular override attempt occurred, the same date stamped on my memo. We stepped into the secure server chamber. The air inside was cooler, drier. Racks of hardware blinked in synchronized rhythms, thousands of LEDs pulsing like a silent city at night. Familiar, comforting, still mine. A military police technical officer stood beside one of the console stations, reviewing a mirrored data set. He turned as I approached. "Dr. Hale," he said evenly, We need confirmation regarding adaptive key handoff procedures during transition week. No accusation in his voice. Only precision. I leaned over the console, reviewing the extracted logs. Timestamps aligned in a clean vertical column. Override account usage highlighted in amber. Encryption cycle rotation markers in blue. And there it was. 3 override attempts occurring minutes before scheduled key rotations. Attempts that would have temporarily disabled a secondary authentication layer I had insisted remain intact. If those attempts had succeeded during live rotation, the system wouldn't have collapsed. It would have weakened, quietly, the kind of weakening that doesn't trigger alarms immediately, but introduces vulnerability. I felt the wave shift again, not anger this time, shock, not because someone tried to access the module, but because they tried during migration week. Were these attempts authorized? The officer asked. No, I replied. They contradict documented transition safeguards. He nodded once and typed a notation into the reconciliation file. 1 notation, 1 federal record entry, that's all it takes. By midday, word had spread internally that the override account belonged to senior operations. Administrative leave was no longer a rumor. It was confirmation. In the conference room adjacent to the server chamber, compliance officers reviewed policy binders and digital audit trails. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic, it was meticulous. Pens moving, screens flickering, voices measured. When systems investigate themselves, the tone becomes surgical. Around 2:30 p.m., I was asked to present the original migration plan. I stood before the same glass wall where, days ago, whispers followed me into the elevator. Now the room was silent. I explained the adaptive key exchange framework, the layered authentication safeguards, the rationale for maintaining secondary locks during executive overrides. No emotion, no commentary, just structure. When I finished, one compliance officer asked, "Had the override succeeded during rotation, what would have occurred?" I paused, not for drama, but for accuracy. The encryption would have remained functional, I said, but the integrity assurance window would have narrowed. External detection risk would increase. In simpler terms, the system would look fine. Until it wasn't. The silence afterward felt heavier than any accusation, because intent matters less than impact in federal review. At 4:11 p.m., I stepped back into the corridor and felt something unfamiliar rising. Not triumph, not satisfaction, relief. Relief that I had documented. Relief that I had walked out quietly instead of reacting emotionally. Relief that truth, when archived properly, doesn't require raised voices. Before leaving, the liaison officer approached me once more. "Your clearance status remains unaffected," he said. "We appreciate your cooperation." Appreciate? Such a small word for the difference between professional erasure and professional validation. As I exited the building, winter light caught the mirrored facade again. But this time, the reflection didn't feel brittle. It felt transparent. Inside, an internal notice was already circulating. Leadership restructuring effective immediately. Interim oversight assigned. Restructuring. That's how institutions describe correction. I didn't need public apologies. I didn't need dramatic scenes. The record existed. The override attempts were logged. The false clearance report was preserved. And the system, cold, impartial, procedural, had responded. Quietly, just like I did. Tomorrow would bring formal conclusions. But tonight, the balance had shifted permanently. The official notice arrived on a Monday. No dramatic headline, no sweeping apology, just a formally structured document delivered through secure channels, stamped and archived. Reconciliation complete. Clearance status verified. Reporting discrepancy confirmed. 3 sentences. 3 corrections. The first restored what had never been lost. The second validated what had been questioned. The third preserved what had been attempted. Inside the company, leadership restructuring had already solidified. Interim oversight became permanent oversight. The phrase procedural lapse appeared in internal communications, followed by commitment to compliance reinforcement. Language always softens consequences. Records do not. I returned one final time to collect the last of my personal items from the office I once occupied. The building no longer felt tense. It felt cautious. Doors closed more deliberately. Conversations paused less abruptly. People met my gaze without flinching. Respect, when regained through documentation rather than confrontation, has a different weight. Lena walked beside me in the corridor. "They're revising override protocols," she said quietly. "Secondary locks can no longer be bypassed during migration windows, not even by executive accounts." Good. Not because it proved me right, because it made the system stronger. That's the part no one sees from the outside. Victory in environments like this isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with applause or dramatic confessions. It arrives as policy updates, as footnotes, as silent acknowledgments that something changed. In the server room, the racks blinked steadily. Encryption cycles rotated cleanly, each transition logged, verified, mirrored. The adaptive key exchange model was now fully active, precisely on schedule. No delay, no collapse, no weakness. I placed my palm lightly against the cool metal casing of the nearest server rack. 8 years of architecture lived inside these systems. Algorithms built with patience, safeguards layered with foresight, integrity woven into code. No one could revoke that. On my way out, I passed the conference room where it had started, the room where a single sentence attempted to erase a career. "Your clearance expired." The irony no longer stung. Because clearance hadn't expired, trust had. And trust, unlike clearance, does not renew automatically. Outside, winter had softened. The air carried the faint promise of early spring. Sunlight stretched longer across the pavement, warming the edges of the cold. I paused before stepping fully into it. Military police had closed their review. The false reporting entry remained in federal record. No dramatic charges, no spectacle, just consequences aligned with protocol. The senior operations manager's profile had quietly disappeared from the leadership directory. No announcement, no farewell email. Systems correct themselves without ceremony. My phone buzzed one last time, a secure message from the liaison officer. "Thank you for maintaining professionalism throughout this process." Professionalism? Some would call it restraint, others might call it strategy. I call it understanding how power actually works. Power isn't in shouting, it isn't in public humiliation, it isn't even in being right. Power is in preserving proof. When I walked away that first afternoon, I wasn't surrendering. I was creating space for the system to reveal itself. And it did. The building behind me gleamed under the sun, no cracks visible from the outside. But inside, policies had tightened, oversight had sharpened, logs were reviewed with greater care. Not because I fought, because I documented. As I drove away, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Clarity, the kind that comes when truth doesn't need volume. It only needs time and a record.